The cell was cold, and it smelled like rust and old stone, and something chemical that Elias Morrow had never been able to name even after 11 months of breathing it every single day. He sat cross-legged on the metal slab that the Vraxi called a bed, and he counted the cracks in the ceiling the way he always did when the lights dimmed for what passed as nighttime on Tarthos 9. Tarthos 9 was not a planet, and it was not a moon, and it was not a station in any way that made sense to a human mind. It was a prison carved into the belly of an asteroid somewhere in the deep black, between two dying star systems, and the Vraxi Dominion had built it that way on purpose, because no one was supposed to find it, and no one was supposed to leave it. Elias Morrow was not supposed to be here either. He was a forward scout for the UNSC Wayward Son, and 11 months ago his recon shuttle had been pulled out of skip space by a Vraxi gravity net. And before he could even send a distress signal, he was in restraints, and then he was in a cell, and then he was forgotten. That was what the Vraxi did with problems they did not want to solve right away. They forgot them. But Elias Morrow was not the kind of man who stayed forgotten. In the first week, he learned the guard rotation by the sound of their footsteps, because Vraxi were insected, and their legs clicked on metal in rhythms that were almost musical if you listened long enough. In the second week, he started learning their language, and the guards laughed at him because no soft species prisoner had ever bothered before, and their laughter turned to silence by the fourth week when he spoke to them in fluent low-caste Vraxi and asked politely for cleaner water. In the sixth week, he figured out the locking mechanism on his restraints just by listening to the tonal frequency the guards used to activate them, and he could have opened them any time after that, but he did not because it was not yet time for that. In the third month, he organized a hunger strike. Not a violent one, and not a loud one, but a quiet, coordinated refusal to eat that spread across 60 prisoners from 12 different species, most of whom had never shared a single word before Elias Morrow sat down between them in the mess hall and started translating. The Vraxi moved him to solitary after that. Overseer Keth Sauron made the order personally. Keth Sauron was the warden of Tarthos 9, and he was enormous even by Vraxi standards, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with a segmented body covered in dark chitin and compound eyes that reflected light like shattered amber and mandibles plated in ceremonial gold that clicked when he was thinking. He stood outside the solitary cell and looked down at the human sitting calmly on the floor, and he said, "You are more trouble than you are worth." Elias looked up at him and said, "Then let me go." Keth Sauron did not laugh because Vraxi did not laugh, but his mandibles clicked rapidly, which meant something close to amusement, and he walked away and did not think about the human again for a long time. That was his first mistake. Months passed. Elias kept his head down and he watched and he listened, and he learned the station the way a sailor learns the sea, not just the shape of it, but the feel of it, the rhythm of it, the way the air moved through the corridors, and the way the organic walls pulsed faintly, because Tarthos 9 was partly alive, grown from bioengineered material that the Vraxi used for all their major constructions. He learned which guards were cruel, and which were just tired, and which ones flinched when they had to hit a prisoner. He learned that the Vraxi caste system was brutal and rigid, and that the low-caste guards were only one rung above the prisoners themselves, and that some of them knew it. He filed all of this away in the quiet, organized space behind his eyes, and he waited. And then one morning, he submitted a formal ration request. It went through the prison bureaucracy, the way all requests did, which meant it was stamped and forwarded and stamped again and forwarded again, and no one really read it because no one really cared. The request was simple. It read live protein, culturally appropriate to omnivore dietary needs. This was technically correct because humans are omnivores, and because the Vraxi ration system did allow for species-specific dietary accommodations, even for prisoners, although those accommodations were rarely honored and almost never monitored. The request landed on the desk of a supply officer named Droon. Droon was low caste and bored and underpaid, and he had been stationed on Tarthos 9 for 3 years, which was about 2 years and 11 months longer than anyone could serve on a prison asteroid, without losing their mind. He looked at the request, and he did not understand it because he did not know what humans ate, and he did not care enough to find out. He checked the biocargo manifest, and he saw live protein stock, and he pulled the first thing that matched. It was a Selkie. The Selkie was small, about the size of a Terran dog, with a soft rounded body that had no hard edges or sharp parts and large dark eyes that took up most of its face and skin that glowed faintly with bioluminescent shifting colors, based on what it was feeling. Right now it was glowing pale blue. Pale blue meant terrified. Droon carried it by the scruff of its neck down 3 corridors and 2 elevators, and he opened the slot at the bottom of Morrow's cell door, and he shoved the creature through, and he walked away, and he did not think about it again, because it was just livestock and the human was just a prisoner, and none of it mattered. Inside the cell Elias, Morrow stared at the thing that had just been pushed through his door. It was trembling so hard that its glow flickered like a candle in wind, and it had pressed itself into the farthest corner of the cell, and it was making a sound that was almost too soft to hear, a kind of low, vibrating hum that Elias felt more in his chest than in his ears. He did not move. He sat very still on his metal slab, and he watched the creature, and the creature watched him, and for a long time neither of them did anything at all. Elias knew what it was. He had read about the Selkie in the Wayward Son's xenobiology database before his capture, and he remembered 2 things about them. The first was that the Vraxi classified them as livestock. The second was that the xenobiology team had flagged that classification as, quote, almost certainly wrong, unquote. He looked at the Selkie. The Selkie looked at him. Its glow shifted just slightly from pale blue to something a fraction warmer, like the first hint of dawn on a cold morning. Elias slowly, very slowly lowered himself to the floor and sat cross-legged across from the creature, and he kept his hands open and visible, and his voice low and steady. "Hey there," he said. The Selkie flinched. "That is okay," he said. "You do not have to come closer." He reached into his ration tray and pulled out a piece of the nutrient block that the Vraxi gave prisoners, and he set it on the floor halfway between them, and then he pulled his hand back. The Selkie did not move. "That is okay too," he said. He sat there for a long time, just breathing and being still and letting the creature understand that he was not going to grab it or hurt it or eat it. Somewhere above them in the surveillance room, a Vraxi monitoring officer watched the feed from Cell 7 Sigma on a flickering screen, and he frowned. The human was just sitting there. The livestock was just sitting there. Why was the human not eating? He flagged it as a minor anomaly and moved on because there were 600 cells to monitor, and he was only one officer, and the human was only one prisoner, and the creature was only one piece of livestock. None of it mattered. None of it was important. That was their second mistake. Elias named the creature on the second day. He did not think about it very hard, because the name came to him the way obvious things always do, which is quietly and all at once. He called it lumen. It was a Latin word, and it meant light, and it fit because the Selkie glowed, and because Elias had been in the dark for 11 months, and because sometimes the simplest names carry the most weight. Lumen did not eat the nutrient block on the first night or the second, but on the third morning Elias woke to find the block gone, and Lumen sitting a little bit closer than before, still pale blue, but no longer flickering. That was progress. Over the next several days, Elias built a routine, and he built it carefully, the way you build anything when the other person is scared and small and does not yet know that you will not hurt them. He shared his rations every meal, pushing half across the floor and eating his own half slowly and calmly, so that Lumen could see that the food was safe. He tore a strip from his blanket and folded it into a small nest in the corner of the cell, and he set it down near T. He warmest point on the floor where the bioorganic walls pulsed faintly, with the station's living heat. Lumen watched him do all of this with those enormous dark eyes, and on the 5th day the creature climbed into the nest and curled up, and its glow shifted from pale blue to something softer and warmer. Amber. Elias sat on his slab and watched that color change, and he felt something crack open in his chest that he had kept sealed shut for 11 months. He had been so careful to stay strong and stay sharp and stay ready, and he had done all of that by not feeling too much, because feeling too much in a place like this could kill you faster than any guard or any weapon. But watching this small, frightened creature finally feel safe enough to rest in a nest he had made from his own blanket, that broke something open. And what came flooding in was not weakness. It was purpose. He began to study Lumen, the way he studied everything, which was patiently and completely. The Seleki communicated through bioluminescence, and through that low vibrating hum that Elias had felt on the first night, and through subtle shifts in posture and movement that were so delicate most species would never notice them. But Elias noticed. He noticed that Lumen's glow brightened when Elias spoke softly, and dimmed when the guards walked past outside. He noticed that the hum changed pitch depending on what Lumen was feeling, and that it was not random noise, but structured almost like language. He noticed that when he sat close to Lumen and kept his own breathing steady, and his own mind calm, the creature's glow would synchronize with his heartbeat, and he would feel a warmth spreading through his chest that was not physical but emotional, like someone was sitting beside him, and saying without words, "You are not alone." The Seleki were empaths. Elias had known this from the xenobiology files, but knowing it as a fact and experiencing it as a reality were two completely different things. Lumen did not just sense emotions. Lumen shared them. And more than that, Lumen responded to them, amplified them, reflected them back in ways that were gentle and honest, and completely without pretense. When Elias was calm, Lumen was calm. When Elias felt a spike of anger at the sound of a guard beating a prisoner down the hall, Lumen would glow a sharp red, and then slowly ease it back to amber, as if saying, "I feel that too, but we are safe here." It was not telepathy, and it was not mind control, and it was nothing like the Vraxi had described in their classification files, where they called the Seleki's empathic abilities disruptive to hierarchical discipline. It was just connection. Plain, simple, honest connection. And it was the most human thing Elias had encountered since his capture, even though it came from a creature that was not human at all. By the 2nd week, Elias was certain of something that the Vraxi had either never understood or had deliberately chosen to ignore. Lumen was not livestock. Lumen was not an animal. Lumen was a person. A young person scared and displaced and torn from whatever family or community the Seleki still had left somewhere in the galaxy. And Elias Morrow had never in his life been able to walk away from someone who needed help. Word began to spread through Block 7. Not because Elias told anyone, but because the other prisoners could feel it. There was a Torvon 3 cells down named Gravik, who was built like a boulder with stone-colored skin and hands that could crush metal, and he had been imprisoned for leading a mining revolt on his homeworld, and he had not spoken to another prisoner in 2 years. One morning he stopped outside Elias' cell and stood there for a long time, and then he said, "I sleep better now," and he walked away. There was a Nathai on the upper tier named Selith, who had 4 arms and skin that shifted between blue and green depending on the humidity, and she was an insurrectionist from a water world, and she was very smart and very angry, and she had been angry for so long that she had forgotten what anything else felt like. She started sitting in the corridor outside Elias' cell during free hour, and she did not say anything for 3 days, and then on the 4th day She said, "What is that feeling?" And Elias said, "That is Lumen," and Selith said, "No, I mean the feeling," and Elias said, "I know." And there was Rin. Rin was a Helvan, and the Helvan were predators built for hunting with long limbs and retractable claws and eyes that could see in total darkness. And she had scars across her face and her arms and her torso that told a story she never shared because Rin did not speak. Could not speak. Chose not to speak. She appeared outside the cell one evening, and she looked at Lumen through the bars, and Lumen looked back at her and glowed a deep, steady purple that Elias had not seen before. And Rin stood there for a very long time, and then she walked to the end of the corridor and sat down with her back to the wall, and she stayed there. She came back every day after that. Elias did not ask her to guard the corridor. She just did. Lumen's empathic field was growing. It was subtle at first, just a faint sense of calm that hung in the air around Block 7 like the smell of rain before a storm. But as Lumen grew more comfortable and more connected to Elias, it expanded outward, seeping through the walls and the floors and the corridors like warmth from a fire. Prisoners who had spent years in hostile silence began to nod at each other in the hallways. A fight broke out in the mess hall and ended before the guards arrived because 3 prisoners stepped in and calmed it down, not with force but with words. Violence in Block 7 dropped to 0. Overseer Kethsaron noticed. He stood in the surveillance room and watched the data feeds, and his mandibles clicked slowly and steadily, which meant he was not amused this time. He was thinking. He pulled up Morrow's cell feed and watched the human sitting on the floor with the glowing creature curled in his lap, and around them through the corridors and the cells, a prison full of broken, angry beings was becoming something else. Something organized. Something connected. Something that looked almost like a community. Kethsaron walked down to Block 7 himself, and he stood outside the cell, and he looked at the human and the Seliki, and his compound eyes reflected their combined glow amber and gold. "You were given food," he said. Elias looked up and his face was calm, and his voice was steady. "I was given a person," he said. "I made a friend." The overseer stared at him for a long time, and then he turned and walked away, and his footsteps clicked sharply on the metal floor all the way back to the command level. He ordered increased surveillance on Block 7. He ordered additional guards stationed at every entrance. And in the surveillance room that night, the analyst on duty noticed something in the data that made her antennae flatten against her skull. Lumen's empathic frequency was resonating through the station's bioorganic walls. It was faint and it was subtle, and most instruments would not have detected it. But it was there, and it was spreading. 6 weeks after Lumen arrived in his cell, Elias, Morrow looked around Block 7 and realized he had built something. He had not planned it exactly, or at least he had not planned all of it, because some of what happened was just what happens when you take broken people and give them a reason to trust each other. But some of it he had planned very carefully. The community had grown. Over 100 prisoners across multiple species and multiple cell blocks had connected into a loose network that ran on shared meals and traded skills and mutual respect. And at the center of all of it was a small glowing creature who did not understand politics or strategy, but understood something much more important. Lumen understood how to make people feel like they mattered. Gravik the Torvan had become the unofficial engineer of the group. And this was because Gravik had spent 40 years working in deep core mines before his revolt, and he understood structural materials the way a musician understands sound. He studied the bioorganic walls of Tarthos 9, with his massive hands pressing his palms flat against the living surface, and feeling the pulse of the station's biological systems beneath the chitin. He told Elias these walls grow. And Elias said yes, and Gravik said that means they can be shaped. And Elias said yes, I was hoping you would notice that. Sealith the Nathai had taken on water systems, because water was what Sealith knew better than anyone alive, and she mapped the entire hydration and waste reclamation network of Tarthos 9, using nothing but her own observations, and a piece of charcoal she had sharpened against the floor. She showed Elias the map one evening, and he looked at it and nodded, and said, "Can you flood a section if you needed to?" And Sealith's skin shifted to a dark blue, which meant she was excited. And she said, "I can flood 6. Rin still did not speak, but Rin did not need to speak because what Rin did was more valuable than words. She patrolled. She moved through the corridors of Block 7 like a shadow, and wherever she went the small cruelties that prisons breed, the stealing and the bullying, and the casual violence simply stopped. Not because she threatened anyone, although everyone knew what the Helvan were capable of, but because Lumen's empathic field had settled into Rin like water into dry earth, and the predator who had carried rage and silence like armor for years now carried something else. She carried calm, and calm from a Helvan was more intimidating than violence from anything else in the galaxy. Elias watched all of this happening, and he felt a deep, steady warmth in his chest that was partly Lumen's influence, and partly something entirely his own. He had not asked anyone to fight. He had not asked anyone to rebel. He had done the most human thing he could think of, which was to look at a group of strangers who had been broken and isolated and afraid, and say, "You are not alone, and you are not worthless, and you have something to offer." And they had believed him. Not because he was charismatic or powerful or special in any way that the Vraxi would have recognized, but because he meant it. And people can tell when you mean it. The Vraxi guards began to fracture. It started small with the low-caste guards who were stationed in Block 7 and who had been standing in Lumen's empathic field for weeks. These guards were not cruel by nature, but they had been trained to cruelty by a system that ranked them only slightly above the prisoners they watched, and that told them every day that their value came from their obedience and nothing else. Lumen's field did not care about caste. It did not distinguish between prisoner and guard, between highborn and lowborn, between those in cells and those holding the keys. It simply radiated what it always radiated, which was the raw, honest truth of what everyone around it was feeling. And what the low-caste guards were feeling was exhaustion and shame, and a quiet, desperate longing for something that their rigid hierarchical world had never given them. A sense of belonging. 2 guards began lingering near Block 7 during their off hours. One of them, a young Vraxi named Tethrani, started leaving extra rations outside Elia's cell, and when the surveillance system flagged it, she said it was a data error, and no one questioned her because no one cared about a few extra nutrient blocks. Another guard, an older one with a cracked mandible and tired eyes, simply stopped enforcing minor infractions in Block 7, and when his supervisor asked why, he said the prisoners are compliant, and that was true enough that the supervisor moved on. Overseer Kethzoran saw all of this. He saw it in the data, and he saw it in the behavior reports, and he saw it in the faces of his own guards, and what he saw frightened him more than any riot or any escape attempt ever could. Because riots could be crushed and escapes could be prevented, but what was happening in Block 7 was something else entirely. It was loyalty. And loyalty that crossed the line between prisoner and guard was the one thing that could bring a prison down from the inside. He made his decision. He issued the order on a cold morning when the station lights were still dim, and his voice was flat and certain when he spoke to his command staff. The Seliki creature in Cell 7 Sigma is to be confiscated and destroyed immediately, and the human prisoner is to be returned to maximum isolation with no further accommodations. The squad he sent was 6 guards strong, all high caste, all armed with pulse lances that could burn through stone, and they marched down the corridor toward Block 7 with the mechanical precision that the Vraxi were known for. They rounded the corner and stopped. Elias Morrow was standing at the door of his cell. The door was open. Not broken and not forced, but simply open as if someone had entered the correct tonal code and swung it wide. And that is exactly what had happened, because Elias had decoded that frequency in his second month and had simply chosen not to use it until now. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides, and Lumen was perched on his shoulder, glowing a deep, resolute gold that filled the corridor with warm light. Behind him, the corridor was full. Gravik stood with his massive arms folded across his stone chest, and Seelith stood with all four arms loose and ready, and Rin stood at the far end of the hall perfectly still, with her eyes catching the light like two dark mirrors. And around them, in doorways and along the walls, and sitting on the floor and standing shoulder to shoulder, were dozens of prisoners from a dozen species, all silent, all watching, all present. No one held a weapon. No one made a threat. They were simply there. The lead guard, a high caste officer with polished chitin and cold eyes, looked at the open cell, and the glowing creature, and the human standing calmly in front of a wall of unified prisoners, and he hesitated. Elias spoke, and his voice was not loud, but it carried the way truth carries, which is further than shouting ever could. "You can take Lumen," he said, "but you should know that every being in this corridor will remember that you did, and they will remember that I asked you not to." The lead guard looked at the prisoners. The prisoners looked back. Lumen's glow pulsed once warm and steady, and the guard felt it wash over him like sunlight through glass, and for one moment, just one, he felt what the prisoners felt, and what the low-caste guards felt, and what Lumen had been broadcasting for weeks. Connection. The guard lowered his lance. He turned to his squad and said, "The situation is contained," and they withdrew back down the corridor, and their footsteps faded into silence. In the command center, Keth Sauron listened to the report, and his mandibles clicked, not with amusement this time, but with something closer to fury. He opened a secure channel to Vraxi Dominion High Command, and he requested authorization for a full purge of Block 7. The response came back within the hour. High Command was busy. There was an expanding human fleet pressing against the border colonies, and there were resource disputes in 3 sectors, and there was a political crisis on the homeworld, and a single prison warden's request to purge 1 cell block of 1 facility on 1 asteroid was not a priority. "Handle it quietly," the message said. "Do not escalate, and do not contact us again with minor administrative issues." Keth Sauron closed the channel and sat in the dark of his command center, and for the first time in his career, he felt something unfamiliar. He felt afraid. Down in Block 7, the lights had dimmed for the night cycle, and Elias sat on the floor of his open cell with Lumen in his lap and Gravik leaning against the wall outside, and Seelith sitting, cross-legged in the corridor, reviewing her maps, and Rin standing watch at the far end where the shadows were deepest. "They are going to come back," Elias said quietly. Lumen's glow dimmed slightly, and Elias felt the creature's worry pass through him like a cold breeze. He stroked Lumen's back gently, and the glow steadied. "Good thing, I have been planning for that," he said. And in the dark of Block 7, surrounded by people who had been strangers and enemies and prisoners, and who were now something else entirely, Elias Morrow began to explain what they were going to do next. Keth Sauron came for them at what passed for dawn on Tarthos 9, when the station lights were still warming from black to gray, and the corridors were at their quietest. He brought everyone. Every high-caste guard on the station armored and armed, and organized into 3 assault columns that moved through the main corridors with the clicking synchronized precision of a machine built for violence. His plan was simple, because the best plans always are. Column 1 would seal the main corridor of Block 7 and cut atmospheric support to the section, which would begin suffocating everyone inside within 8 minutes. Column 2 would breach from the maintenance tunnels below and drive the prisoners upward into the sealed corridor, where they would have nowhere to go. Column 3 would hold the perimeter and ensure that no prisoner from any other block could intervene. The Seleki would be killed first because Keth Sauron understood now, even if he could not fully articulate it, that the creature was the heart of whatever Morrow had built, and you kill the heart before you kill the body. It was a sound plan. It should have worked. It did not work because Elias Morrow had spent 11 months studying this station, with the patient, obsessive thoroughness that humans bring to problems they intend to survive, and he knew things about Tarthos 9 that even its warden did not know. The atmospheric systems were the first thing. Keth Sauron gave T. He order and the environmental officer entered the kill code for Block 7's air supply, and for 3 seconds the system responded normally and the air began to thin, and then it stopped. Because Gravik had spent the last 4 weeks growing structural reinforcements directly into the bioorganic walls around the atmospheric conduits, and the station's living tissue had accepted them as part of itself, the way a body accepts a graft, and those reinforcements now blocked every single emergency shutdown valve in the section. The Vraxi had designed their stations to be alive and self-sustaining, and they had never considered that someone might learn to work with that living architecture, rather than against it. Gravik had considered it because Elias had asked him to. Keth Sauron received the report that atmospheric shutdown had failed, and his mandibles went still, which was worse than clicking, because stillness meant he was beyond anger and into something colder. He ordered Column 2 into the maintenance tunnels. They made it approximately 40 meters before the tunnels flooded. Seelith had spent 3 weeks mapping every water line and waste reclamation pipe in the section, and she had identified 6 critical junction points, where a simple mechanical blockage would redirect thousands of liters of recycled water away from the filtration system and directly into the maintenance tunnel network. She had not needed any tools to create those blockages, because the Nathai were aquatic by nature, and their 4 arms could work underwater with a precision that no Vraxi engineer could match. The guards in the tunnels were not hurt because Seelith had calibrated the flood to be chest-deep on a Vraxi, which was inconvenient and frightening, and completely disabling but not lethal. Elias had been very specific about that. No one dies, he had said, and he had said it in a voice that was quiet and firm, and allowed no argument, and even Rin, who had spent years in silence, and who carried violence in her body like a second skeleton, had looked at him and nodded. No one dies. Keth Sauron lost Column 2 in the span of 3 minutes, and he stood in his command center and watched the water levels rise on the tactical display, and he felt the cold fear in his chest spreading. He ordered Column 3 to hold position, and he opened a communications channel to call for reinforcements from the nearest Dominion outpost. The channel was dead. Rin had done that. She had moved through the upper maintenance levels in the dark where her Helvan eyes could see perfectly, and where no Vraxi patrol ever went, because there was nothing up there worth guarding, and she had found the communications array, and she had disabled it not by destroying it because destruction was loud and permanent, but by removing 3 small components and hiding them in places that would take the Vraxi engineers days to locate. The station was blind. It was deaf. And Keth Sauron was alone. Down in Block 7, the lights were steady, and the air was clean, and Elias Morrow stepped out of the corridor into the main junction, where Column 1 was holding position behind a barricade of pulse lances and riot shields. He was unarmed. He was wearing the same thin gray prisoner uniform he had worn for 11 months, and his feet were bare on the cold metal floor, and he looked thin and tired, and completely unremarkable in every way except for his eyes, which were steady and calm and focused. Lumen sat on his shoulder, glowing so brightly now that the light filled the junction like a small sun, and the shadows pulled back from the walls, and the Vraxi guards squinted against the glare. Behind Elias, the prisoners of Block 7 filed into the corridor one by one, not rushing and not shouting and not fighting, but simply walking forward and standing, and being present the way they had been present when the first squad came, and the way they would be present for whatever came next. Elias stopped 10 meters from the barricade. He looked at the guards, and the guards looked at him, and for a moment the only sound was the hum of the station's living walls and the faint, steady pulse of Lumen's light. And then Lumen broadcast. It was not a sound exactly, and it was not a light exactly, and it was not anything that the Vraxi had instruments to measure, because what Lumen did was not physical in the way they understood physical. Lumen simply opened up. Every wall that the little creature had built around itself for survival, every boundary, every filter, every self-protective instinct that had kept its empathic abilities contained and manageable simply dissolved. And what poured out through the bioorganic walls and the corridors and the cells and the command levels and every single living space on Tarthos 9 was not a weapon and was not an attack. It was truth. Every guard on that barricade felt it hit them like warm water, like stepping into sunlight after years in a dark room. They felt the prisoners, not as threats and not as numbers and not as problems to be managed, but as people with pain and fear and loneliness and stubborn, ridiculous hope. They felt Gravik's steady, patient endurance and the 40 years of honest work that came before his revolt and the betrayal that drove him to it. They felt Seelith's fierce intelligence and the ocean world she was taken from, and the rage that was really just grief wearing armor. They felt Rin's silence and what lived inside that silence, which was not emptiness, but a sorrow so deep and so old that words could not carry it. They felt Elias and his calm, relentless refusal to stop caring about people, even when caring was dangerous, even when caring was stupid, even when caring was the hardest thing a person could do in a place designed to crush it out of you. And they felt Lumen. They felt the last echo of a nearly extinct species, a small, soft creature that had been classified as livestock by an empire that could not be bothered to listen, and that had been thrown into a cell as food, and that had instead been given a name and a nest and a friend. They felt Lumen's loneliness and Lumen's gratitude and Lumen's simple trembling wish, which was the same wish that every living being carries in the deepest part of themselves. Please let me live. Please let me matter. Half the guards dropped their weapons. Some of them knelt on the metal floor with their compound eyes, wet, which should not have been possible for Vraxi, but was happening anyway. Others stood frozen, unable to move forward, and unable to move back, caught between duty and something older and more powerful than duty. The barricade dissolved. Not all at once and not without confusion, but it dissolved the way ice dissolves in spring, not because anyone forced it, but because the thing holding it together simply was not strong enough anymore. Kethsaron came through the junction from the command level at a full charge. He was wearing his ceremonial command armor, which was heavier and more shielded than standard issue, and it blocked enough of Lumen's broadcast that he could still move and still think and still feel the cold, clear fury that had driven him from his command center down to the junction to do what his guards could not. He was going to kill the human himself. He was 8 feet tall and armored, and his mandibles were spread wide, and he was fast, very fast, faster than anything that large should have been. He covered the distance in seconds, and Elias did not move because Elias knew he did not need to. Rin appeared from the shadows like she had been waiting there all along, which she had. She hit Kethsaron from the side with the full force of a Helvan combat strike, and the Overseer went sideways into the wall hard enough to crack the bioorganic surface. And before he could recover, Rin was on him with her claws locked around his armored wrists, and her face inches from his and her dark eyes staring into his compound ones. She did not kill him. She held him there pinned against the cracked wall, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and Lumen's broadcast washed over both of them. Rin spoke. It was the first word anyone had heard her say in years, and it was only one word, and she said it quietly. Enough. Kethsoran stopped struggling. The station was theirs. Elias walked to the main communications console in the command center, and he sat down in the overseer's chair, which was far too large for him, and he keyed the system back online after telling Rin where the missing components were. He opened every channel, military and civilian and emergency and commercial, all at once, and he spoke. This is Sergeant Elias Morrow, UNSC, broadcasting from Vraxi Prison Station. Tarthos 9, the station is under prisoner control. We have wounded, we have civilians, we are requesting extraction. He paused and rubbed his face with one hand, and Lumen nuzzled against his neck, glowing a tired but steady gold. Also, he said, if anyone out there knows what a Seliki eats, we would really appreciate. Sayed the help. Another pause. Morrow out. He closed the channel and leaned back in the too large chair and closed his eyes, and Lumen hummed softly against his skin. And for the first time in 11 months, Elias Morrow allowed himself to feel something he had not permitted since the day of his capture. He felt relief. The UNSC Fast Response Frigate Defiant Mercy dropped out of skip space 71 hours after Elias Morrow's broadcast, and it came in hot with weapons armed and boarding teams ready, because the tactical briefing said prison riot, and prison riots meant chaos and violence and blood on the walls. Commander Adjora Osai stood on the bridge and watched Tarthos 9 grow on the viewscreen, a dark, ugly chunk of rock hanging in the void between dead stars, and she prepared herself for the worst. What she found was not the worst. What she found was something she had never seen before in 22 years of military service. The boarding team breached the main airlock and moved through the entry corridor in tactical formation, expecting resistance, and instead finding a Torvan standing at the junction with his massive arms folded and a calm expression on his boulder-like face. He said, "You must be the rescue," and the team leader said yes. And the Torvan said, "Good, the wounded are in the medical bay, and the human is in the command center, and there is hot water if you want some, although I cannot promise it tastes good." Commander Os walked through the corridors of Tarthos 9, and she saw things that did not match any prison liberation she had ever conducted or studied or heard about. The prisoners were organized. Not in the frantic, desperate way that people organize when they are in crisis, but in the calm, deliberate way that people organize when they have been working together for a long time and trust each other. The wounded had been triaged and treated using medical supplies taken from the station's infirmary, and the treatments had been administered by prisoners who had medical training from their previous lives, and by guards who had surrendered and offered to help. The guards who had surrendered, and there were many of them, far more than anyone expected, were being held in a separate section of the station, and they were not caged. They were fed and they were unharmed, and they had access to clean water and sanitation, and several of them were sitting quietly playing a tile game that one of the prisoners had taught them. Osai stood in the doorway of the guard holding area and stared, and her executive officer, Lieutenant Park, stood beside her and stared, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Osai turned and walked to the command center. Elias Morrow was sitting in the overseer's chair, which was absurdly large for a human, and he looked thin and tired and older than his 34 years. And on his shoulder sat a small glowing creature that turned to look at Osai with enormous dark eyes and pulsed a gentle, welcoming amber. Osai stopped in the doorway. "Sergeant," she said, "what the hell happened here?" Elias looked at her, and his face was calm and his eyes were steady, and he had the expression of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and was not yet ready to put it down. "They gave me a friend," he said, "and I gave them a problem." Osai opened her mouth and closed it and opened it again, and then she turned to Lieutenant Park and said, "Get medical in here now, and get me a direct line to Fleet Command, and find out what that creature eats. The Defiant Mercy's crew spent 48 hours processing Tarthos 9, and in that time, the story of what had happened began to spread because Elias' broadcast had gone out on every open channel in the sector, and open channels do not stay quiet. A cargo hauler picked it up first and relayed it to a trading post, and the trading post relayed it to a news aggregator on a neutral world, and within 12 hours the story was everywhere. The human prisoner who turned a Vraxi prison inside out without throwing a single punch. The small glowing creature that made an Empire soldiers lay down their weapons. The warden who sent guards to kill and watched them kneel instead. The galactic networks could not get enough of it. The Vraxi Dominion tried to suppress it. They issued an official statement calling the incident a minor security disturbance that had been exaggerated by hostile media, and they classified all records related to Tarthos 9, and they reassigned every officer who had been involved to remote postings where they would not be interviewed. It did not matter. The story was already too big and too good, and it spread the way all great stories spread, which is unstoppably. Xenobiologists from 4 different species published papers within the month, confirming what Elias had known from the beginning, which was that the Seleki were fully sapient beings with complex emotional communication, and a cultural memory that stretched back thousands of years, and that their classification as livestock by the Vraxi Dominion was not a mistake, but a deliberate act of erasure. The Galactic Accords convened an emergency session on the status of the Seleki. The Vraxi ambassador argued that internal classification of species within Dominion territory was a sovereign matter and not subject to external review. The human ambassador stood up and projected an image of lumen glowing gold on Elias' shoulder and said nothing at all and sat back down. The vote was unanimous. The Seleki were granted protected sapient status within the year, and a recovery mission was launched to find and protect the remaining population scattered across Vraxi space, and the Dominion protested loudly, but could do nothing about it because the political cost of fighting it was higher than the political cost of conceding. Lumen became, in a technical and unofficial sense, the first Seleki ambassador. This was not a formal title, and no one appointed Lumen to anything because Lumen did not understand titles or appointments and would not have cared about them anyway. But what happened was that wherever Elias went, Lumen went, and wherever Lumen went, people in the room became unusually honest and unusually cooperative and unusually willing to listen to each other. And this turned out to be extraordinarily inconvenient for several galactic powers who relied on deception and posturing as core diplomatic strategies. The Nothai delegation complained that their trade negotiations had become significantly more difficult since the Seleki started attending sessions. The Torvan ambassador said good. Tarthos 9 was decommissioned. The asteroid was emptied and sealed and left to drift in the dark between the dead stars, and no one mourned it. But the people who had lived inside it did not scatter the way freed prisoners usually do. Gravik stayed with Elias because Gravik had spent 40 years building things for people who did not value him, and now he had found someone who did. Seelith stayed because she was brilliant and angry, and she had discovered that her anger worked better when it was aimed at something worth hitting, and Elias had a talent for finding things worth hitting. Rin stayed because Rin had spoken one word in the junction of Tarthos 9, and that word had cracked open a door inside her that had been sealed shut for years, and she was not ready to close it again. Others came too. Prisoners who had been freed and had nowhere to go, and guards who had laid down their weapons and could not go back, and beings from a dozen worlds who heard the story and felt something stir inside them that they could not name. They formed something new. It was not a military unit, and it was not a government, and it was not a corporation or a charity or a church. It was just a group of people who had decided to stay together, because together they were better than they were apart. The galaxy did not have a word for it yet. Elias called it a crew. On the Vraxi homeworld in the deep chambers beneath the capital hive, where the air was warm and thick, and smelled like old metal, the High Commander of the Dominion's Military Intelligence Division sat behind a desk made of polished chitin and reviewed the final incident report on Tarthos 9. Across from him stood the intelligence officer, who had originally assessed the captured human scout 11 months before the assessment that had read low-priority minimal-threat species, too young to pose strategic concern. The High Commander read the report from beginning to end, and then he set it down and looked at the officer and said what went wrong. The officer stood at attention, and his mandibles were tight, and his voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that the High Commander recognized, because he had heard it in the voices of every officer who had been involved with Tarthos 9. It was the sound of someone who had learned something they wished they had not learned. "We put a human in a cage," the officer s. We starved him and we isolated him, and when he asked for food, we gave him someone to care about. The High Commander stared, and the officer swallowed, which was a gesture that Vraxi did when they were about to say something that frightened them. "And humans do not abandon those they care about," he said. "They build around them. We gave him a foundation, and he built a nation out of it." The High Commander was silent for a long time. Then he entered a new classification into the military database. All human prisoners across all Dominion facilities were to be immediately reclassified to maximum threat status, with no accommodations, no contact with other prisoners, and absolutely under no circumstances any living biological material in their cells. It would not help. It would not help because the Vraxi still did not understand, and might never understand what made humans dangerous. It was not their technology, and it was not their strength, and it was not their numbers. It was the thing that Elias Morrow had carried into a cold, dark cell on a dead asteroid, and had refused to let go of even when letting go would have been easier and safer and smarter. It was the stubborn, irrational, magnificent compulsion to look at a frightened creature in a dark room and say, "You matter and I am not going to leave you." The defiant mercy made the jump to skip space on a bright, silent morning, and Elias sat on the observation deck and watched the stars stretch into long white lines, and Lumen hummed softly in his lap, glowing a warm, steady gold. Behind him, Gravik was arguing with Seelith about water pressure tolerances, and Seelith was winning, because Seelith always won arguments about water, and Rin was sitting in the corner with her eyes closed, and her breathing steady, and the faintest hint of something on her scarred face that might have been peace. Elias rested his hand on Lumen's back and felt the warmth pulse through him, and he thought about the cold cell and the dark months and the trembling blue light in the corner. He thought about what the Vraxi had given him when they threw a frightened creature through a slot in a door and expected him to consume it. They had given him the most dangerous thing in the universe. They had given him someone to protect. And he smiled, and the stars blazed gold around them as the ship carried them forward into whatever came next.